Today's country lies in the southwestern Pacific and is famous for its 850 languages, isolated tribes, and diverse wildlife. Get ready for our next stop around the world, Papua New Guinea. My story happened during a university trip to the highlands of Papua New Guinea. The highlands are a mountainous region with valleys and rivers in the center of the country. In other words, we were in the middle of the jungle. I should backtrack and explain this trip was sponsored and funded by my university, but the program contains students from all over the world, from Germany to South Africa to Australia. I met some really awesome people during this trip, both international students and indigenous Melanesians. We shared stories of our studies, our hobbies, and our overall differences in culture. Everyone should one day connect with people from different countries, and you'll see for yourself how much you're missing out on in life. It was an experience I'll never forget, both from the people I met and what I'm about to tell you next. The trip was a 2-week-long program, and we were nearing the end of our journey with 4 days left in hand. So far, we did some crazy things like exploring caves, floating down rivers, and foraging the jungle for food. Because we were nearing the end of the trip, me and a couple Europeans wanted to do something on our own without the whole group, something that would feel more special and memorable. We asked the tour guide about any recommendations, no matter the safety level or cost, and he suggested we talk to the elders about a healing ritual. This meant we would venture deeper into the jungle and really feel what it would be like to live with the indigenous tribes. Plus, with some issues back home, I could use some healing in my life. The tour guide escorted us to the site, but explained he wouldn't be able to walk us back until 4 hours later because of the jungle hike he had to lead with the main group. We had no issue with this, because the more time spent with these indigenous people, the better. We were first kindly greeted by older men with crazy paint covering their bodies and piercings from every orifice possible. Based on these people's age, we assumed these were the elders our tour guide was telling us about. A younger man helped translate for us, but he was speaking a form of English where I couldn't understand every word he was saying, almost like it was a hybrid version. For the most part though, I could understand the men were excited to bring us to a special person that was inside a hut preparing a ceremony. After 5 minutes and awkward small talk, the villagers gathered in a circle and I could see smoke flowing out of the hut. Through the smoke appeared something out of a dream, or maybe a nightmare. A figure dressed in black feathers, red and yellow paint, colorful jewels, beads, braids, and a mask resembling a crocodile head started growling in a very deep voice. I think he was summoning the spirits who would grant the protection and wellness. What followed was a sporadic dance with a pole covered in feathers in one hand and a smoking pouch swinging in the other. A Swedish girl who was standing next to me was hysterically laughing at the ritual, so much that her face was bright red, and I could see the veins popping out of her forehead. It was very awkward because everybody else was very focused on the ritual, not even giving the slightest of smirks. The loudness of the witch doctor, or spiritual healer, I don't know the proper title for this, was a little bit scary, but I still found it very fascinating. The ritual concluded with a kind of dust thrown into each individual's face, with the villagers clapping and yelling with excitement. That was definitely one of the coolest experiences ever, and I must admit I did feel a little protection surrounding my soul. The 4 hours eventually passed, and our tour guide arrived back on time to gather us and prepare for the dinner feast. The rest of the night went as usual. We ate a nice dinner, talked about plans for the next couple of days, and went over travel plans to ensure everyone arrived home safely. During the middle of my slumber, I was suddenly awakened by our tour guide pleading for me to get up. Dazed and confused, I asked what the problem was and why he was up at this hour. He very firmly told me there wasn't much time and I had to gather my bags and come with him. Whatever it was, it seemed like an emergency, so I relented and quickly got my things together. When I walked outside, I saw the Swedish girl and the other European guy that accompanied me in our trip earlier in the day. They looked very distraught and wide awake even though it was the middle of the night. The tour guide swung the door open and said it was time. He demanded we move quickly, so we were practically jogging in the dark jungle with only one flashlight lighting the way. As we moved further out of the jungle, a truck was sitting at a clearing, just waiting for us. A man jumped out of the truck and threw our bags in. The tour guide took the passenger seat and told us to get in, so we did. After we sped off, the truth came out. Apparently, the witch doctor told the villagers that the Swedish girl was a witch and that they were to creep up on us in the middle of the night and bring us back to the village where we would be stoned to death. This was because she was hysterically laughing during the ritual, which made her appear to be possessed by an evil spirit. The villagers, who are deeply superstitious and fearful of offending their gods, believed that something had to be done. I'm sure her fair skin and blonde hair also contributed to their suspicions. A villager who did not want to entertain the violence ran over to our tour guide to warn him about the potential danger coming our way. I thank God for him, because if he hadn't warned us, we wouldn't have been able to evacuate, and that may have been the end for us. We quickly reached Port Moresby and flew home the following day. Please be mindful of the setting you are in and the cultures you are interacting with. I was traveling to the Pacific for sustainability work about a decade ago. My team was comprised of myself as the biologist, a colleague Wilson as the chemist, and another guy Carl as the data scientist. Our mission was to research Pacific coral reefs and compare their health to data that was collected in the early 2000s. This would help identify any need for further protection against harmful pollutants and tourists. We first toured in Cairns, Australia, then made our way to Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The trip was going better as expected. The beaches and reefs were paradise on Earth, and the data we collected was incredibly valuable. We still had one more stop before finalizing our studies, a country nobody on the team had yet to visit, Papua New Guinea. We were all extremely excited for the finale, because who can say they've been to Papua New Guinea? To stay within the trip's budget, we took a boat to the island instead of flying like we did for our previous two destinations. Just like Cairns and Guadalcanal, the water was extremely blue with shallow reefs encompassing the sea. The major difference for this site is the primitiveness and secrecy of the region. Australia and the Marshall Islands had lots of fishermen and tourists out in the water, while this place was much quieter and isolated. Don't get me wrong, it was a feeling I've never experienced, and it was refreshing to say the least. It sounds contradictory, but to feel so far away from Western civilization made me feel comforted, but uneasy. If anything were to happen, we'd be very far away from any help. I put this thought in the back of my head as best I could, and decided to direct my entire attention to the job at hand and enjoy the surrounding scenery. We were warmly greeted by the villagers on the island, who to my surprise knew a decent bit of English. We were shown to our rooms we'd be staying in for the next few days, which were a series of jungle huts. Ironically, as a biologist, I have a deathly fear of large bugs, so I was very on edge about the huts, but had no choice and had to tough it out. We spent the first day getting to know the villagers and about their island and surrounding waters. Also, who knew the food in Papua New Guinea was spectacular? We ate some type of bowl with sweet potatoes, coconut, a couple things I couldn't identify, and the fish that I assumed was a snapper. We asked about the wildlife and were directed towards a reef they called the aquarium because of the high level of biodiversity. This was music to our ears. The more diversity we could gather, the stronger our study would be. The aquarium was only a 5-minute boat ride from the island, which meant we could practically visit the site as many times as we wanted. Our host Steve took us out to the aquarium just before sunset to give us an idea of what we would be working with the following morning. We didn't get wet since we just ate and wanted to save all our energy for the morning snorkel. We obviously couldn't see anything from the boat, but were curious as to how this spot was any different than the other reefs we could see earlier in the day. There weren't any nearby islands or structure nearby, just the same ocean surface as far as the eye could see. There wasn't any doubt that the reef below wasn't as special as the fisherman claimed. It was just a strange spot. After introducing us to the work site, Steve drove us back to the village, gave us the coordinates, and handed us the keys to our rented boat. The plan was to arise at dawn when the fish and other creatures would be most active. This plan unexpectedly changed. Carl, the data scientist, insisted we instead return to the aquarium tonight because new species that are nocturnal, like sharks, would be out and could add to our data. Wilson and I were completely exhausted and, against our better judgment, agreed to the night outing because of the advantages of an altered setting. We also had plenty of time left to snorkel in the daytime. I grabbed the keys and we quietly left the dock around midnight. The full moon shined on the rippled water and illuminated the sky ahead of us. It was the perfect diving conditions. We needed someone on the boat at all times in case the anchor gives way, so Wilson volunteered to be the first. Carl and I put on our wetsuits, strapped on our lights, and plunged into the darkness. Immediately, we saw a beautiful reef with many fishes holding close to the coral. So far so good, but no sign of sharks. 20 minutes later, after identifying several new tropical fish species, it was my turn to be the boat watch and switch with Wilson. The boat was easy to identify because of the many lights we strapped on the hull before we left. It was like a giant highlighter rising and ebbing in the ocean. As I boarded our boat, Wilson was already in his suit with his lights, ecstatic to get wet. I had no other task than to keep an eye out for 2 headlights in the water and watch the stopwatch on my phone count down. All was perfectly peaceful and quiet until I could make out a quiet humming noise in the distance. It was faint, but loud enough to hear over the waves hitting the boat. I could tell the noise was coming from the west, opposite of where my colleagues were, but I couldn't see anything besides the water and the bright moon ahead. The hum slowly grew as each second passed, and eventually became close enough that I realized it was the sound of an outboard motor. Shortly after this realization, I made out the silhouette of a boat concealing itself in the dark night, and it was headed straight towards us. The fear I felt was immeasurable, and froze me for so long I lost sight of my colleagues in the water. I didn't know these people's intentions, but their absence of lights at this hour was a scary sign. I was having a panic attack. Do I turn off the lights to hide in the darkness, or do I leave them on so my colleagues don't get lost? I decided it was safer to hide, then search later. After turning everything off, I could actually see my surroundings a lot better, and spotted Carl and Wilson's tiny headlamps far off to my right side. I reeled the anchor up and slowly drifted towards them until I was close enough to explain it was time to leave. They were confused, but could hear the seriousness in my voice and quietly climbed aboard. By this time, the boat was half the distance away from when I first noticed it, and it wasn't slowing down. Like I said earlier, there was no bank to stick close to avoid being the sitting duck we were in the middle of the ocean. We turned the motor on, but at the lowest speed to keep as quiet as possible while still moving out of sight. In retrospect, this was the biggest mistake we could have made. The boat was now so close to us we could hear the men shouting in a language we couldn't understand. our cover was blown. With one swift motion, the boat pressed against our starboard side, and 5 men, all armed, leapt onto our boat, continuing to scream and point their rifles at us. We'd been captured by modern-day pirates. The men seemed thrown off for a second, as if something wasn't going to plan. They looked back at a very muscular, shirtless man, who I presumed was the leader. He spoke to them quickly in a demanding tone while pointing aggressively at us. We were knelt down with a cold metal barrel pressed hard against our necks, while the pirates ransacked the boat, taking everything from our testing equipment to our phones and wallets. I was so pumped with adrenaline and fear, I didn't know what else to do other than comply and remain still. All I could think about were my wife and my 2 kids waiting for me back home. The pirates cleared everything so quickly and systematically, like they've done this hundreds of times before. As the pirates started to return to their boat, they left a parting gift by knocking us onto our stomachs with the stocks of their rifles and violently kicking with their bare feet. I remember gasping for air and accepting this as my last night on Earth. With the grace of God, I heard the same haunting sound of the motor that started this nightmare turn on and slowly fade into the night. It was finally over. Carl and Wilson were so badly injured, but were still conscious and could get on their feet. We waited until we were alone again, and sped back to the island as fast as possible. A couple people were surprisingly waiting for us at the dock, because they were awoken by our motor ripping across the waves on full throttle. We were brought to the local doctor, who said besides the black eyes and aching muscles, that we would be alright, and it was a miracle that we were granted mercy. I don't know why we were allowed to live, or why the pirates didn't just take our boat entirely. Perhaps they were completely shocked to see a couple of white guys out in the middle of the night. Maybe they knew the darkness masked their identity. We won't ever know the answer to these questions, but I am beyond grateful to live another day. For the first 10 years of my life, I grew up with my entire family, parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, anyone you could possibly think of. Alongside my family were other families, and more families besides them. All to say, we had a very close community. We belonged to a tribe where there was no technology, no phones, television, or no news outlets from the outside world. The men and boys would be out hunting and watching the lands, while the women and girls would cook and tend to the children. Each day would consist of similar tasks, and each night would be very peaceful. I was 10 when I relocated to a coastal village, and it wasn't for a job or education. It was to escape from something I still cannot identify. Back one night, I could not sleep from an illness, so I was up for most of the night. I heard something rustling outside, so I peered out and saw a little boy from another family slowly walking on his toes, with his head slanted upwards, as if he was searching for something in a trance-like state. I whispered his name, but he just kept walking. I called out for him again, this time louder, and he jumped back in surprise. I told him to go to sleep, but he waved me off and kept venturing further away from our village. I figured there was nothing I could do, so I tried going back to sleep with little success. The next morning, I woke up to people urgently searching for something. The boy was gone. I told my mother I saw him walk down towards the river last night, and he disappeared, but even with this knowledge, nobody could find him. People started to worry someone had upset the spirits, so more and more protective necklaces were being worn around the village. 2 months after the boy's disappearance, a teenage girl suddenly vanished in the night and was not found despite a week-long search. The spirits seemed to only take the children. The most memorable night of my life was when it was my turn. I woke up around the same time when I witnessed the boy walking to the river. I was covered in sweat and shivering, like when you wake up from a bad nightmare. Because I had just woken up, my senses were acute, which allowed me to hear it. A soft woman's voice was calling my name down by the river. She just kept repeating it over and over again, each time with more urgency. I felt very calm and drawn to the voice, like I had to investigate and see who or what was calling me. I quietly rose and tiptoed over to the woman who was still calling me over. We were always told not to go off at night, but I was just going to discover the source, and that was it. When I made it close enough to see the river, a tall figure stood watching me, but it had something poking out of its head. Through my blurred vision, I realized it was antlers, so it must have been a deer. But then if it was a deer, why was it standing on 2 legs? It was also making this unnatural jerking motion with its head, like it had some brain disease. Once more, I heard a soft woman's voice calling my name, but there was no doubt now that the deer, or whatever this thing was the source. I stood there staring at it until it quickly dropped to the ground and disappeared out of sight, which prompted me to run back home. I luckily made it back, and everyone was still sound asleep until I burst in crying and wailing. The elders determined what I encountered lured me to the river that night to drown me, and since I saw the creature, it wouldn't stop hunting me down. This is why my family and I were forced to leave and relocate to a coastal village where we would be far enough from whatever was snatching unsuspecting children. I am happy in my new home though, and I hope my past family is still recovering from the horrors they faced.